It is a pleasure to lead this conversation with this distinguished panel. I'm going to get straight into it. Fali already set the stage for it. And President Ruto, you have been very vocal about the need to reform the global financial architecture and what Africa is specifically asking for, not a handout. You're not asking for a debt write-off. You're just asking for what is fair and just. Why is it something that you have essentially led with straight from your election coming to the presidency? You wasted no time in making this very clear.
We're just making a statement of fact. And that is what it is. We do not think our continent is going to be developed using charity or handouts or arms or tokens. We have talked in our continent about potential. And this guy keeps telling me it's over. The time to talk about potential is over. Move it to opportunity, move it to investment. And the way to do that is to make sure that our situation in the continent is such that we have equal opportunity like everybody else. For a very long time, we've had a wrong argument. We've tried to blame this person and the other person and engaged in a toxic, unnecessary conversation. What we are now saying is, look, we want a win-win outcome. We have assets as a continent. We have enormous renewable assets. 60% of all renewable energy is in our continent. 30%, maybe 40% of all critical minerals are in our continent. We have 60% of all arable uncultivated land today, and we have the youngest population. These assets must count for something. And all we are saying is, how do we work to convert our assets from the potential they are today into opportunity and into investment? And we have given 3 areas. We've said, first and foremost, let us deal with the elephant in the room. That for us to access resources for development, we pay 5, 6, 7, sometimes 8 times more in the financial market. Reason? The rating agencies, risk analysis, sovereign debt frameworks are, let me not use the bad word rigged, but it is something almost there. Because these rating agencies assign very high risk to our continent. What we end up doing is that we pay interest more than others, and that is the reason why today, of the 10 countries that are in debt distress, 6 are from Africa. All of them are in the developing world. Because if you're paying 8 times more, you're set up for distress from the beginning. And that is the correction we want to make. We are saying the rating agencies, the risk analysis frameworks must be reformed. And let me tell you, it works both ways. The reason why we ended up in a financial crisis in 2007 is because of the same rating agencies. They were wrong that time. I bet you they are wrong today about us. So that is number one. That's number one. Number two, we need a financial system apart from treating everybody equally. And all, we are saying that we do not want favorable treatment. We want fair treatment. If others are paying 2%, let's pay 2%. We shouldn't be paying 14%, right? I think it's just fair. Number two, we are saying for countries that are almost in debt distress, 52 countries, Secretary General of UN said yesterday, 52 countries representing 3.4 billion people are either high risk or moderate risk in debt distress. We need to pull back these countries. We need a mechanism that pulls back these countries. We have suggested that, number one, let us do a longer term tenure of their sovereign debts. Let us put in there a grace period, 5, 10 years. This will give them a breather because it is no longer possible to do development without doing climate action because those are one and the same going forward. And finally, is the biggest elephant in the room. 2 aspects. We have said that it is now time for us to leverage on the balance sheets of the multilateral development banks, create additional concessional resources, $500 billion, it's possible. Let's look at liquidity challenges. How do we go for another SDR facility? We went for it during COVID. Why can't we go for it to deal with debt distress and to deal with climate action? And finally, carbon tax. It is time we have a conversation, a candid conversation about carbon tax. When we say carbon tax, others say carbon pricing. You know, it's an escapist ideology. What we want, and we have said this, is we are ready for a carbon tax on fossil fuel trade that is administered at a place and at a level where settling banks can collect that money. It is the only way we are going to get adequate resources to unlock the potential we have in renewable energy. Today, investment in renewable energy, 2%, only 2% get to Africa. Of the $300 trillion that was invested in renewable energy, only $54 billion came to our continent. It is time we got that much leverage on investment capital, because what is standing between Africa and our opportunities are investment capital, and that is what we are looking for. And we are saying, unless we reform the financial architecture, we will continue to be in a circus. We will remain at potential. We will never get to the opportunities that we have.
Mr. President, why did you shy away from using the bad word rigging? And when many African leaders feel that the global financial system is rigged against them?
I'm just trying to be a gentleman. What somebody told me one time, it is not presidential.
Okay, fair enough. President Adesina, we are not a poor continent. We're exceedingly rich. And yet we keep having this conversation that President Ruto refers to as toxic and unnecessary every time about the need to reform the global financial system.
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to recognize the inequities in the global financial system. There's no doubt about it. And just think of the following. Now, we are way behind and way off course when it comes to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. The UN Secretary General says that we're totally off course on that. Africa will need $1.2 trillion, right, per year to be able to be on course for that Sustainable Development Goal. But the global financial architecture is not delivering those resources to Africa. The president was talking about the whole issue of climate change. It's the same situation. You've got a continent, 9 out of the 10 countries that are most vulnerable to climate change in the world are in Africa. It loses $7 to $15 billion a year to climate change, and we think that's going to rise to $50 billion by 2030. But how much is the global climate financial architecture delivering for Africa? That's the question, right? We're only getting 3% of it. 2021, we had $653 billion of global climate finance. Africa got only $30 billion of that. Okay, so you can see there's a lot of inequities in that. It's very difficult for African countries to access those climate finance. It's very, very long process. It's a very tedious process. It's not transparent. You don't have a lot of African representation on the boards of many of these climate financing institutions to be able to access that. And worse, Africa faces climate adaptation. That's what we've got to do. But how much are we getting for climate adaptation in Africa? Well, $11 billion. And that has to rise 10 times. And I want to commend His Excellency President Ruto for the leadership that he shows with the African Climate Summit that we had. And this is one of the issues that we discussed. But let's come back to another inequity that has been there. We can't walk away from this issue, Larry. But take the COVID situation. How much was the fiscal response globally to that? They got $19 trillion. The G20 developed countries, right, got about $15 trillion of that. And how much do you think Africa got? $83 billion, 0.3%
Wow.
of the global. And so we have to start thinking about scale. speed, and adequacy. The fact of the matter is, while the rest of the world was trying to get booster shots, right, Africa could not afford just a single basic shot. And I'll tell you one other inequity in the system. We have conditional in global financing that goes because of shocks, and we have the SDR reallocation, which Mr. President, I'll come back to that later, Mr. President was talking about. Well, you got IMF, and Kristalina, my sister, did a great job, and Secretary Yellen, fantastic job, but we got $650 billion. Out of the $650 billion, Africa got only $33 billion for a continent of 1.2, 1.3 billion people. You know, so you can see that it's an embedded bias, okay, on Africa when it comes to this particular issue. And I'll end by coming back to the point the president raised about the issue of debt and the issue of the rating agencies. He's absolutely correct. Take a look at the situation with the debt resolution in Africa. It takes a long time. We had the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, okay, highly indebted poor countries. I don't like that term. How can you be highly indebted? You're poor. It's like you're not going to survive any way you look at it. Yeah, but you have a situation where Africa is paying so much debt today. And as the world is leading with global inflation, and you have contraction in monetary policy, it's driving up interest rates. The amount of money that Africa is paying for debt is going up. We're paying 18% of our GDP right now, going to debt. But the rating agencies, as the president says, they downgraded 61 countries during just after COVID. 61 countries. 60% of those were in Africa, right? And so we've been talking about ourselves, you know, why is it that for the same amount of risk, exposure or rating, Africa is paying 700 basis points or more than those in other parts of the world, based on what you call the Africa risk premium? No, we're not rating Africa fairly, justly, and I think in a transparent way. They're not as risky as others, and I'll close on this point. We financed, Larry, a study by Bloomberg, Moody's Analytics. And what did they find about loss in terms of infrastructure? Africa's loss globally on infrastructure is 5.5%. In Asia, 8.5%. In Latin America, Caribbean, all that, 13.5%. And are you telling me that there's a high risk of actually investing in Africa? No. And so these are the president may not want to use the thing. I'm not going to say it's rigged. I just want to say it's unfair. And that's why fundamentally, whether it's on climate, whether it's on debt, whether it is the way in which we do ratings, and whether it is how we do global conditional financing to deal with global shocks, we have to make sure Africa gets a fair, equitable treatment. And the global financial architecture, both in terms of structure, conduct, and performance, has to change.
All right, Mr. Diop. Yes, you can clap for him. You've been on both sides of this debate, starting with your work at the World Bank, in government, in the private sector, and what you currently do now, the IFC. This conversation is not new, so I wonder what your take, a fresh take on it is, seeing as you've sat on both sides of it.
What I take from this is action, action, action. Right? I think that His Excellency the President has said very clearly what is done in terms of looking at the architecture, at the fundamentals of what needs to be done. But unfortunately, sometimes these things take time, and unfortunately, the continent cannot wait for this time to happen. So I think that there are opportunities here that are before us, and we were talking about it many times, and I think that one of them is agriculture. I am really...
They're both former agriculture ministers of their countries.
But let's...
And we love each other.
Let's talk about it, okay? As His Excellency and my brother Akin said, the potential is here. Let's stop talking about the potential, okay? Let's talk about what needs to be done to move it. Today, in the conversation of climate change, which is important, 90% of the conversation is about mitigation, little about adaptation. Adaptation is mainly water in the African continent. I lived in Kenya.
Yes.
I saw the impact of drought. I'm coming from the Sahel. I'm from Senegal. The conversation was not heard in the past in climate change. Why? To be true, is because it was not affecting the most advanced country. Now, the south of Europe is facing drought. The western part of the US is facing drought. I think that the next COP should be an opportunity to make a strong commitment about investing in water and to allow agriculture, African agriculture to move forward. Second, climate change and the new economy on climate change. This is a high time when you're talking about diversifying the supply chain geographically and so forth, to use the opportunity of the African continent to be able to be part of the supply chain on coming from the lithium to the battery. There is no reason why today in the continent, with the competencies that we have, with the resources that we have, with the African Free Trade Agreement, which will allow to build very robust supply chain on the continent, that we are not a player in the battery space. So I would like to bring the conversation also to some of the verticals that we could work on to be able to move the needle on this. The third point for me, which is important, is that we have an opportunity also to diversify our economy and make it much less prone to these shocks. And I think that's what I have to go back to visit the Savannah Valley.
Silicon Savannah.
Silicon Savannah
Valley.
Yes.
I think that this is the type of question that we need to think about. How to take these opportunities that we are offered now with climate change, with the food crisis, with so forth, to be able. We have in Africa today, we talk about fertilizer crisis. But one of the largest producers of fertilizer is in Africa, OCP, is in Africa. They are ready to work on the market. So what I would like us to do is to take, with my brother Akin, we have pushed for the private sector alliance in Africa to do that, to have more means to do inter-Africa trade. Here, Mwangi is sitting here, and in the past, he would have problem to have a trade financing to be able to export to Dakar or to Abidjan or to Joburg. We need to change it. And that's why we are working on to be able to create this supply chain. So I'm not talking about the trend that my brothers have already mentioned. His Excellency the President has set up the agenda. But I think that I would just us to focus on opportunities that are before us that we can seize now, but not wait for people offering it to the continent. But we need to come and take it in our own hands and make it a reality.
All right, thank you. And Gail, we just came from, President Ruto hosted the Africa Climate Summit. African countries came together with one voice talking about their platform. And you launched the One Campaign, a report in Nairobi about African countries are paying up to 500% more for borrowing in the commercial markets than they would if they were borrowing from the World Bank. Right. And this illustrates the problem, doesn't it?
In the extreme. I mean, look, part of the problem we're trying to solve is affordable capital at scale, right? This pandemic thing that happened, right? The countries in the G20 before the AU became a member spent $14 trillion in stimulus. Africa wasn't able to do that. You can't just call the central bank and say, would you print money? I mean, you could, but it would be ill-advised. So you've got this huge deficit there. So where does the capital come from? What our study found is largely because of the increase in interest rates, which a couple of people have mentioned. Africa's paying 500% more to borrow money on the private market than if that capital was available from the World Bank. As the president of the FDB has pointed out, the cost of Africa's debt payments has increased by 56 billion. Now, the answer there is not to say, well, nobody can raise interest rates, because that's one of the things a country does to manage its economy. The answer is to pick up the solutions that are out there. This is a bad, big problem. The solutions are on the table. This whole issue of how do we reform the multilateral banks, which is a start on working on the global architecture. First of all, we should call it modernization.
Okay.
It's not going back and tweaking it. It's looking to what we need over the next 20 years. So how do we modernize it? Those solutions are out there. Are they 100% complete? Are there other things that are needed? For sure. There's solutions on the table. We need the political will, the political capital, to translate those solutions into action. Not modest incremental change, but big, bold leadership. Some of that may come from shareholders. I think a lot of it's going to come from Africa. So let me end on this point, because I think there are three things that are vital here. The first is facts. Larry, you asked, and the president is an extremely good diplomat in not saying the system is rigged. Here's the thing. The system is structurally imbalanced, unfair. It's not what it needs to be. If your argument is that it's rigged, you're in a political argument, and the other side's going to be on the defensive. I've served in 3 administrations. Trust me, somebody says you guys are unfair. Everybody's like, no, no, no. So the facts, the number of facts that have been put on the table here and that Africa is using to make these arguments, that starts to begin a fair fight and, frankly, a productive discussion. The second is representation. The fact that the African Union now has a seat on the G20, the G21, is huge. Maximizing that presence is going to be key because Africa can change the discussion. Prior to the last summit, the discussion at the G20 has been countries representing 60% of the world's population. Now, a lot more of the other 40% can show up. That's a different conversation. The last thing, as an observer and somebody who's worked on these issues my whole life and with many of the people here, I think the biggest game changer is the unified voice that is coming out of the continent. When there's a common position from heads of state, from finance ministers, from civil society networks, that is power. That is real power. And so my hope, and I think what we can do, we've got the facts, the solutions are out there, representation, and the power for unified voice.
Dr. Adesina was nodding aggressively as you said that. You're Africa's optimist in chief. Do you have things to be optimistic about still?
Yeah, no, I just want to comment on what an excellent point that Gail was making about the global financial architecture and how the MDBs needs to change.
Yeah.
First and foremost is that, there's no doubt about it that we can deliver more. MDBs are leveraging machines, right? We leverage resources a lot because we're AAA rated and we have preferred creditor status. So first thing is we have to make sure that we increase the capital for the MDBs. But the critical thing is the paid-in capital, because we got $145 trillion of assets under management globally that we have to attract towards infrastructure, water, sanitation, hospitals, transport systems, and all that. But to be able to do that, they have right risk, and Mokhtar from IFC and others are working on that. But the key is you need risk capital to leverage private sector. The second thing I think we need to do with the global financial architecture, for the MDBs in particular, is also to make sure that we rebalance focusing on global public goods and regional public goods. Look, I run African Development Bank. I think the capital of the African Development Bank, we should be lending $100 billion a year to tackle all the issues that we have. So it's not just about dealing with global issues, but also making sure we're working with African Union on so many things. So we need all that capital there. The third thing that I think we can do with the MDBs is just sweat our balance sheet better. And we are leading. Today, we are the leader when it comes to doing synthetic securitization. We launched that in 2018, the first one done globally, right? And now we're working with the UK government support for $2 billion to be able to take the risks of portfolio from our sovereign portfolio, and we put it out to the private sector, institutional investors. I mean, we just opened up $2 billion for ourselves. The last point, special drawing rights. The special drawing rights are the solution, Mr. President. We discussed about that in Nairobi. When you look at the model to leverage special drawing rights, the issue is, my sister Kristalina is doing a fantastic job. We love what she's doing and so on. But the fact is, the multilateral development banks can leverage the SDRs by 3 to 4 times. We developed a financial structure that allows us to be able to do that together with the Inter-American Development Bank. What does that mean, Mr. President? You got let's say a $20 billion SDR allocation can easily become $80 billion, just like that. Globally, we are talking about we need $3.8 trillion. If you have issuance of SDR, as President said, $500 billion, but you do it through the Multilateral Development Bank to complement the IMF, that $500 billion become $2 trillion to be able to do all this. So we shouldn't be around this issue talking forever and ever. And we have developed a model that makes it easier now and acceptable now that the reserve asset quality that has to be preserved for the special drawing rights have been done. So, and I'm delighted that we have today several countries joining us to be able to do the rechanneling through the African Development Bank and the Multilateral Development Bank. And I'll end one thing with the President. The president and I in Nairobi, we were talking, and he is a fantastic president. He's very focused, and he's driving a lot of agenda for us in Africa. We were talking about our wealth. How do we measure our wealth? Africa is rich in natural resources, in forests, in biodiversity, and all of that. But why is it that we are rich in natural resources and cash poor? And that's because our natural capital is not part of our GDP. Who says GDP is the best way to measure your wealth? In fact, the reason why we are in the mess we are today is that we've been using the wrong measure of wealth, in which you produce wealth, regardless of the technology and the externalities you create globally. So we have said, what we are going to do is we take, Commissioner is here for AU, we take the whole of the forest basin, Congo Basin, like President and I talked about. It sequesters more carbon than the entire Amazon. Many people don't know that. But Africa gets nothing for that. No, we're not looking for charity. We want to turn our economies green and make sure that the value of the carbon that we sequester is accounted for. And what that means is this. If you have a revalued and rebased GDP based on your carbon and the natural capital, your debt to GDP ratio goes down. You have more headroom, you can borrow more money, and you can do more green investment. So that's where the green wealth of Africa is. That's where the trillions are going to come from. We are tired of being nature rich and cash poor, and we're going to change that.
Yes, President.
And just to confirm what Adesina is saying, it is in bold print in the Nairobi Declaration, exactly what she has said. Revaluing our assets so that we are valued for what we are worth, not what other people think that we are worth. And just two final things. Very fundamentally, listening to Adesina, I had a meeting with Kristalina, I had a meeting with Banker. The MDBs can resolve this. What is lacking is goodwill, political will. But it starts with us. The people in the African continent, we need to speak with one voice, and we don't need to speak in murmurs, and we don't need to speak in low tones. We need to speak loudly about what our situation is. It is possible for us to elongate, to create longer tenure sovereign debt facility. It doesn't require rocket science, and it can be done now. Grace period can be done now. SDRs, they were created for the pandemic. Why isn't it possible for us to create SDRs for climate action? It is an existential threat facing humanity. The economies, 52 economies that are about to go down the debt distress, isn't that serious enough for us to think about this? So the solutions are there. The MDBs can do this. That is why we are unrelenting until it is done. And I like what my sister here said, that as much as we are talking about the credit rating agencies and risk analysis, you're right, we don't want them to be defensive. They don't need to be defensive because they know what we are saying is right. Exactly. They know we are talking the truth. And they know that the whole algorithm around these credit rating issues is not fair. And all we are saying, good people, is it too much to ask for fairness? I mean, really, that is the basic minimum. That's what we are saying. We just want a fair system that serves everybody equally. We do not want to be treated unfairly. We do not want to be rated unfairly. We just want to be rated for who we are and what we are worth.
And President Ruto, you've said this in every forum before President Emmanuel Macron, with Ursula von der Leyen, with every major leader from the global north. Do you feel like you're getting heard?
They are listening. I can tell you they are listening. I can bet you they are listening. The conversation about reform of the international financial system was in murmurs a few years ago. Today, it is being talked by no less than the President of the United States. They have come to the realization that it is no longer possible to run the system the way it has been run. So everybody is reasoning. What is now remaining is the how. And we are going to show them the how.
Yes, sir. Mr. Diop.
I can just only reinforce what His Excellency just said. The G20 declaration is a clear proof that the world is listening and the world is acting on it. We've never seen a declaration like that, which was also clear about the role. The fact that AU have a seat, permanent seat, that was discussed for many years, is it happening. In our own institution, we are meeting in Marrakesh next month. We have the evolution roadmap, which exactly will be addressing some of the issues, how to better leverage our balance sheet, how to improve, to see all our instruments so that we can really expand more credit and more loans and more grant to country in need. That would be very, very clear, and we take some very strong measures in that direction. This morning, His Excellency, I was in a meeting because we launched the private sector lab, and President Ajibanga was there. He was chairing it. It includes 20 top CEOs in the world, and they all attended. And there was, a couple of them were represented by some of their colleagues. And it's chaired by Mark Carney and Shruti, who are Prudential chairman, and you know Mark Carney. And the conversation is very simple. What can we do to attract more capital in developing countries? How is the risk perceived? Why do you price the risk this way? So we're getting in the nitty-gritty of it very practically, and the idea is, are we leveraging better our balance sheet, or is it music to the ear of Mo, because we've been saying that for many years. So we are now coming to discuss very specifically, Excellency, what it will take for our balance sheet in terms of guarantee, first loss, local currency, FX, all these issues are discussed in detail, and I am optimistic that we will see a lot of progress. But let me go back also to what we need. Let's seize that opportunity to structurally change African economies. There is an opportunity, and let's make sure that next time there is a food crisis in the world, it doesn't have the disastrous effect that it had today on the African continent.
All right, we are out of time, so Dr. Adesina, real quick, and then Gail.
I just want to pick up on that point. It's that there's absolutely no reason for Africa to worry about food. None. We have 65% of all the uncultivated arable land left in the world. When that issue that Mokhtar was talking about happened of the Ukraine war, we at the African Development Bank put forward a $1.5 billion immediate food response to allow African countries to produce food. We're supporting today, Larry, 24 million African farmers together to produce 38 million metric tons of food. And that is 8 million more than they are going to lose from actually importing from Russia and also from Ukraine. And then together with the African Union, Mr. President Ruto was there in Senegal with President Macky Sall when we had the Feed Africa Summit. 34 heads of state and government. Look, if you're going to develop, you have to develop with pride. And begging for food is not a way to develop. And what we said, I remember President Ruto on stage looked at me and said, Akin Adesina, you're being kind to us. Is that what he said? He said, really, we shouldn't be talking about food today. We should be talking about how we manufacture aircrafts and things like that. You know, and that's why we put together, with your heads of state, what's called the Food and Agriculture Delivery Compact with the African Union. Today, we've been able to mobilize $72 billion to do that. In 5 years, we should be done with talking about food in Africa. Africa should be talking about other things. Other people go to the moon and land there. We're talking about food. That one, it's not something we should be talking about. And just one more last thing. I want to just state, Mr. President, just one thing. I just want to say that when Gail was talking about some of these externalities, Africa today is the only continent more that does not have a buffer from all these shocks that we talk about. They have it in Asia, they have it in Latin America, they have it in the Gulf countries. There is no financial stability system. How do you exist without buffer? And IMF is the safety net, global safety net of last resort, and we agree with that. However, we can't leave Africa unprotected, and that's why at the African Development Bank, we put forward the need to have Africa financial stability system, just like the EU has. The European financial stability system. So that when you have effects like the shocks from climate, from COVID and all that, and fiscal shocks and debt that we're saying, it doesn't create a contagious effect all across ourselves. We've got to create buffer for ourselves. And I'm a firm believer in the fact that development is not something anybody gives to you on a platter of gold. You've got to want it yourself. You've got to develop your own endogenous solutions because nobody is going to solve it for you.
President Ruto, I saw you wanted to say something as
Just
he
to
was
say
talking.
two things about these two brothers of mine. To assure my good brother that when you go to Marrakesh, we will be behind you. As you think about how to expand that space, I had a good chat with Kristalina and her team, and we are going to do the political side of things. We're going to do the heavy lifting politically to enable you to do what you must do.
Thank you so much.
To commend my good brother here for what he's doing in the agriculture space. The only little quarrel I have is that I got only 70 million of that. and yet I'm the one who campaigned for it.
You're going to get more from private sector.
Yeah. So, but otherwise, I think we're all good. Thank you very much.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Gail, did you want to have a final word real quick?
Like they said.
You agree with everything they said?
No, look, one quick thing. We're at a moment of peril and potential, right? The peril we've heard about, the threat of debt. The potential is that I think Africa can change its own development path, as you discussed. But Africa's in the room at the table big time in this discussion.
I want to live tonight.
And with the kinds of things that have been talked about here, facts, unity of purpose, Africa can change this debate and is changing the debate and thus change the global system. And that's what we all got to focus on.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you so much. Please give a big round of applause to the panel.